Okay, so today I'm going to start a series on Carl Jung's vision seminars. So the vision seminars are a series of lectures given over 3.5 years by Carl Jung in Zurich to an international audience in English, starting in October 1930 through March of 1934. So these seminars detail Jung's symbolic interpretation of the meaning of a series of visions Christiana Morgan had while under his analysis. So Morgan was an American artist who entered analysis with Jung in the 1920s, the late 1920s, when she was about 30. By that time, Christiana Morgan was married and had a child and was having an affair with a psychologist, which prompted her to seek Carl Jung's counsel. So Jung's initial analysis was that Morgan had an overdeveloped thinking function and was out of touch with her unconscious feelings. So the unconscious for Jung is the place of participation mystique, which is the area of one's psychical life, conscious or unconscious life, in which the boundaries between self and other, projection and identification, can become blurred. So what this means, Jung writes, is that this patient had the ability to think hypothetically, that is, to consider intellectual thoughts as separate from her conscious life, or as tentative and subject to revision, or put differently, autonomous and subject to change. So she didn't have this problem where she identified with her intellectual thoughts, but she couldn't do the same with her feelings. So she identified with her feelings and therefore unwittingly was taken under their control. And so the theme of the analysis as it progresses will be this engagement with her feelings as they were represented in the visions that she had under Jung's direction. So Jung taught her how to do active imagination, which is kind of this middle ground between being asleep and being awake, where the individual just allows consciousness to generate images and the patient just watches those images unfold, and Jung calls these Christiana's visions. So Jung characterizes this process as a descent into the unconscious and the encounter with the earthly and natural side of what he sometimes called Christiana's animal personality. So it's this deeper engagement with feeling and the earth that Jung kind of seeks as a potential solution to her problem. So let's say a little bit more about kind of what this problem is. I mentioned that it has to do with her extramarital affair. So let me continue. This earthly grounded aspect of the human being is tied to, in Christiana's case, her relatedness with her husband, which Jung sees as being stifled by her intellect, what he refers to as the ivory tower of her intellect, which then represses the feeling, and the feeling then enters the unconscious and into this realm of participation mystique, where the feeling is then projected onto a man with whom she's having the affair. So in the absence of this earthly emotional relationship with her husband, Morgan's feelings could not come into consciousness, and so the intention of the analysis is to bring Morgan into contact with the symbolic expression of this earthly aspect of her personality so that her feelings could be brought into consciousness rather than being autonomously projected onto her lover. So Jung writes, kind of in summary of this dynamic, quote, "The lack of relatedness is compensated for by a sudden magical relationship, a fascination or participation mystique. Therefore, it is usually love at first sight and the most compulsory form of love." So this is how he's describing her relationship with the man she's having an affair with. And then ultimately, her attempt to suppress this magical relationship of projection and participation mystique with the lover in whom she's locating her feelings ultimately led to her collapse and breakdown and seeking treatment. So Jung traces her repression of her earthly feeling function in part to her conventional morality, reinforced by her parents and her family, who in essence, through their behavior, continually compelled her to repress her feeling. So the idea is that she has these unconscious earthly feelings of relatedness that she could not express in her life because her family basically didn't want her to be in touch with her emotions. So they are repressed and then projected, and then she has this extramarital affair. So in addition, this repression of the feeling function causes to develop in her a strong unconscious masculinity in compensation, a masculinity that continually tries to bring her in contact with the roots of her earthly nature, but that has become overly opinionated, judgmental, and continually critiquing her attempts to express this natural, earthly, feminine feeling. So her expressions of feeling become overly structured and manicured, and that's what led to her collapse. So in describing kind of the dynamic in her family life, Jung writes, one could say that as soon as God began to play in her, that is her kind of earthly feeling function, she was forced to stop. And it's this difficulty for which Morgan is seeking healing. And the solution, Jung tells us kind of preliminarily, is that Morgan has to come to understand the force behind the critical masculine character of her unconscious. So because she was unable to express her feeling, her unconscious developed this strong, opinionated masculine element. And what Jung is suggesting is that she needs to understand this masculine element of her unconscious to see that while she is possessed by it, it itself is possessed by something greater. What Jung says is the spirit of creation and rebirth. And so these lectures are broken into terms, kind of following fall, spring, summer terms. And the first few terms in 1930 into 1931 have to do with engaging with the symbolic expressions of this masculine side, so that she can start to understand. And then ultimately we'll see, I think maybe in 1931, eventually they get to a place where she has this relationship with this masculine element in herself, and she begins to see that there's something greater beyond it that ultimately is the kind of seed of her rebirth and psychological healing. So there exists, Jung concludes, some new manner of relationship with this masculine element of her unconscious through which she might attain this spiritual rebirth. So that was the first lecture, and we'll do the next lecture next time.